Hi, I'm Aubrey Menard, a consultant gender advisor with the Natural Resources Governance Institute, NRGI. The research that I will present today is funded by the Open Government Partnerships Multi-Donor Trust Fund managed by the World Bank. It has been conducted by NRGI in partnership with the World Resources Institute. As we learned in Lesson 1, there's a systemic exclusion of women in the resource extractive sector. In Lesson 2, we are discussing recommendations for promoting the meaningful inclusion of and participation of women. One of the most significant stakeholders in governing women's participation in the sector are governments, which often set the tone and regulations for extractive companies and other stakeholders in how to address the role of women and gender in the sector. However, it can often be difficult to critically identify and assess the means through which governments promote the meaningful participation of women, beyond what is often simply a publicity campaign without any substantive foundation. To assess how governments acknowledge and respond to the systemic inequality of women in the resource extractive industry, we turned our attention to governments' legislative commitments. You see, laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines are the mechanisms through which governments transform political priorities, principles, and commitments into actions and requirements. And so we ask, where and how are governments speaking about women and gender in the extractive sector? And what can we learn about their views on women's participation through their text? We set out to discover whether and how countries rich in oil, gas, and minerals currently reflect the rights of women and gender equality in legal and policy frameworks that govern the extractive sector. As referenced in Lesson 2, there are a myriad of methods through which we can advocate for governments to more meaningfully promote the participation of women in the gender and extractive sectors. Understanding the mechanisms through which countries are currently attempting to address the gender-differentiated impacts of the sector is critical to the effort of drafting better commitments that are more likely to create gender-transformative change. Our research examined the laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines in 12 countries: Argentina, Canada, Colombia, Ghana, Indonesia, Kenya, Mongolia, Morocco, Nigeria, Peru, Sierra Leone, and Tunisia. In these 12 countries, we identified a total of 25 documents that were directly relevant to the extractive sector, in that they specifically govern the sector, for example, national oil or mining laws, and that also mentioned women, gender, or sex. These 25 documents came out of only 9 countries. For Argentina, Morocco, and Tunisia, we were unable to identify any documents that reference both the extractive sector and gender or women. It was also interesting to see how the terms women and gender were used. In general, we found references to women reflected somewhat stereotypical views of the role and status of women. We noted that the use of the word women was more common in older documents from the 1990s and the early 2000s, where more recent documents increasingly use the term gender, though the use of the term women still dominates. The term gender was frequently used as a proxy for woman, but in a small group of documents, a commitment to gender equality was evident. As mentioned previously in the lesson, policies promoting women's participation in extractive industries have the potential to be transformative when they engage women in women's organizations, work with gender disaggregated data, and make efforts to promote transparency. Several of the laws, policies, regulation, and guidelines and other documents that we identified contain provisions that required or promoted women's participation in the extractive sector in different ways. We analyzed the documents using the UNDP's Gender Results Effectiveness Scale. This measures the gender impact of interventions across 5 categories. Gender negative, which means the outcome aggravates or reinforces gender inequalities. Gender blind, which means the results had no attention to gender and failed to acknowledge various different needs. Gender targeted, which means the results focused on the number or equity of men, women, and marginalized people, such as looking for a 50-50 balance. Gender responsive, which means the results address the differential role and needs of men and women and looked for equitable distribution of benefits, resources, and rights. And finally, gender transformative, which sees results contributing to changes in norms, cultural values, power structures, and the root causes of gender inequality. The UNDP created this multifaceted scale in order to measure the impacts of interventions. Because we were only looking at the text of these documents and not their actual implementation, we were not able to assess whether these documents are actually gender transformative or gender responsive, targeted, blind, or negative. Rather, our assessment is limited strictly to the document's potential. This was the distribution of the 25 documents we focused on for our research. As you can see, most documents were gender targeted, meaning that they looked to increase women's or other groups' participation in the extractive industries through quotas or other programs, but did not address the structural causes of inequality. In the documents that we analyzed, countries often use simple quotas to increase women's participation. For example, Ghana's 1993 Minerals Commission Act establishes the commission and requires that 2 of the 7 commission members are women. In fact, all 3 of the Ghanaian laws that we identified include similar quotas, and in each case, this was the sole reflection of women or gender in these laws. Other approaches to women's participation included requirements that women be consulted on local development initiatives related to extractive company operations. However, these requirements were general in their formulation, and it was not clear how they could be implemented or verified. Other documents looked to require the participation of individual women or the participation of organizations representing women. Some documents aim to create gender transformative change by altering the culture around women's participation. But even these ambitious documents often lacked firm requirements or specific mechanisms for creating the change that they prescribed. It isn't simply enough for a document to make a nominal commitment to women's participation or gender equality. The document must include clear provisions that are verifiable, meaning that oversight actors are easily and freely able to check to see that the document's provisions are being implemented. We looked across the documents to see whether it would be possible to verify if the provisions of the law, policy, regulation, or guideline were implemented in practice, or whether there were any measures to enable enforcement. What we found is that while documents included language that expresses a commitment to some form of action or ambition in relation to gender equality or the rights of women, very few of these documents contain provisions that are verifiable or provide enforcement mechanisms. For example, a document may include an intent to consult women when crafting extractive governance policy, but without a requirement for the government or a company to provide verification of with whom they have consulted, these documents may amount to little more than unfulfilled promises. The simpler provisions, such as requiring a certain number of women on a governing board, are easily verifiable. This highlights another issue. Those commitments that are easily verifiable are often unambitious. Those provisions that had greater potential to be gender transformative because they address the root causes of gender inequality or dealt with women's economic empowerment often lacked obvious means of checking implementation or enforcement. In order to have the potential to create gender transformative change, commitments must both be ambitious and verifiable. As you complete this lesson, please begin thinking about how the recommendations included could be verifiable and how oversight actors can hold governments accountable for these commitments to action. Here are some of the biggest observations we've found and things for you to think about as you work with different stakeholders to increase the participation of women in the mining sector. Please let us know what you think of these questions in the discussion forum for your course. We found that the term gender is used in various different ways in governing documents. How might commitments that use the term gender differ from those that use the term women? And in making gender transformative commitments, what should governments do to be explicit about the goal of gender equality? How can implementation and enforcement mechanisms be considered from the early developmental phases of laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines? Can this lead to simplistic approaches that can be measured at the expense of more complex approaches that have greater gender transformative potential? Conversely, if the impact cannot be measured and verified, how can stakeholders assess the value of legal and policy frameworks? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this course module. Again, I'm Aubrey Menard with the Natural Resources Governance Institute, and we hope that this will prompt your thinking about the development of policies that countries can implement that promote gender transformative change for women in the extractive industries. Thank you very much.